I would respected participant to kindly mute you. Yes, thank you so much. We are going to begin today's session with an invocation of a song. So let me just share the screen.
Can you see me again?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, wait. Now she should see me.
Okay.
Yeah.
We are going to begin the session with an invocation of a song. So let me share the screen.
Against the tyranny, bearing down with all its might. Rebel against authority, giving birth to endless night. Scream until your lungs burst, get up and face the fight. Revolt against the darkness and the dimming of the light. Stare across the dunes of time, crazy from the bleakness. Stumble in the wasteland, scared of my own weakness. Looking for the true divine, when will it appear? I'm so locked up, so deep inside, when I look I disappear. It's carved along the mountain walls, history is a lie. The rulers fight for more control, keeping losers on their side. They run their world of violence, make the laws up in their minds. But if committed by the rulers call it crime. Rebel against the secrecy, society's phony rules. Crack the rulers' microscopes that track your every move. Avoid the cold and mindless and hold the throbbing heart that hammers out the words of truth and ignites the holy spark. Cannot see the time no more, only darkness up the road. Gotta make it for the sky falls down, better save than sell your soul. If God is now the father of death, who knows what lies beyond? Religion's hollow promises, the same old numbing songs. If winners write the histories, then drop them in a bin. You can talk a revolution while the kings just sit and grin. They scare you with their sermons, they scare you with their hells. The only thing that's left to say is rebel, rebel, rebel. Rebel against conformity, crushing everything inside. Rebel against anxiety, giving birth to endless night. Scream until your lungs burst, get up and face the fight. Revolt against the darkness and the dimming of the light. Resist against the senselessness, absurdity's empty void. Start to change things by yourself, those changes time avoids. Stand up to false imprisonment that claims free thought is treason. Fight all manipulation, trading lies for truth and reason. Rage against the moralist, the blood, the bread, the wine that sells you the invisible, salvation's phony lines. See what lies before you, remember if you can. The honest don't surrender, but they take it to the end. I rebel against injustice and society's phony love. Revolt against conformity that controls you from above. forgive the cold in spirit and hold the throbbing heart that hammers out the words of truth and ignites the holy spark.
Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Randhir.
So let us begin the talk of today's Swadhyasa Chakra talk. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste, everybody. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Swadhyasa Chakra family and Viswanidhan Center for Asian Blossoming, I welcome you. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available to us distinguished speaker, Dr. Ivan Marquez from Texas State University, San Marcos, Texas, USA, Professor Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, and all the respected participants, Swadhyasa Chakra family, viewers, and listeners. Dr. Ivan
Thank you
Marquez,
so much for welcoming us.
associate, dear and respected friend, I would request you to kindly mute yourself. Dear respected friend, please mute yourself. Yes.
Everyone, please mute yourself so that Randhir can explain.
Okay. So, Dr. Ivan Marquez is an associate professor of philosophy at Texas State University, San Marcos, Texas, USA. He is currently associate professor there, and he currently works in political epistemology. And this talk, in this talk, he will draw a parallel between Chitta Ranjan Das and Albert Camus, seeing both as exemplars of rebellion with socio-historical context of ethical ambiguity. Let me give a brief introduction of our Swadhyasa Chakra. Swadhyasa Chakra, co-learning circle of self and mutual studies. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, and societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chitta Ranjan Das, a creative soul from Orissa, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect our own creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share us with their sadhana, vision, and struggle for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogue. We are also celebrating Chitta Ranjan Das Century Memorial Lecture, and this is the 5th lecture in the series. Before the talk of honorable speaker, let me give a brief introduction of Professor Chitta Ranjan Das, kind of brief biographical speech of Professor Chitta Ranjan Das. Chitta Ranjan Das is a creative seeker and transformative thinker and activist in our times who has written and worked on many aspects of human lives, be it education, philosophy, literature, and integral human development and social transformation. Chitta Ranjan Das was born on 3rd October 1923 in Bengaluru, in the undivided district of Cuttack in Orissa, India, and left his mortal body on January 16, 2011. Das is known to many of his friends, co-travelers, and concerned publics at large in Orissa and India as Chitta Bhai. Chitta has initiated many creative experiments. He founded Jivana Vidyalaya, Life of a School, School of Life, in other words, in Chimpapati Munda in the 1950. He was a pioneer in the integral education movement of Orissa and translated major works of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother into Odia. He nurtured both Agragami, Siksha Dhanant, and Navya Pallava, creative efforts in education and tribal movement in Orissa. He wrote and translated around 250 books, a majority of them being in Odia and some of these in English. With this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri to kindly moderate today's session.
Thank you so much, Randhir, for your very kind and rather so nurturing conversation, and welcome every time. And thank you so much, my dear friend, Dr. Ivan Marquez. I remember our meeting in 2008 in October in his lovely seat and center of learning and creativity. And then it has been a joy to work together, and Ivan very kindly joined us in looking at the book of Spinoza by Chitta, and that was the beginning of our kind of our conjoint journey. So it is so enriching for us to have Ivan, who is a critical philosopher, and also he really travels a wide range of human concerns, philosophy of liberation, as he comes from that South American and Latin American tradition, and also development as freedom, development as revelation, critical philosophy. And it is really enriching to have Ivan with us. Here, as a prelude to listening to Ivan, I just wish to read this paragraph that Ivan had initially written in 2011, and then it also has appeared as an afterword to this book that we have co-edited, the essays of Chitta Ranjan Das, in which Ivan writes, although Chitta is an Indian writer, from my vantage point, I find his sensibility and path closer to Spinoza, Søren Kierkegaard, and Albert Camus than to the Indian pantheon of great 20th century people. And about Spinoza, Chitta had a very spiritual and political journey with Spinoza. Søren Kierkegaard was like his homegrown, philosophical court traveler. As he walked in the streets of Copenhagen, he must have found a kindred spirit walking. Kierkegaard as a traveling philosopher, and Albert Camus, then to the Indian pantheon of great 20th century people. There is an individualism, a radicalism, a humanism, and an enlightenment spirit in him that feels very Western European and very existentialist. It is a spirit of rebellion that shares much with Kierkegaard and Camus. It embodies revolt in spite of and against what appears to be an absurdist undercurrent, a bet on joyful living in spite of life. A bet on joyful living. And here we may remember that Chitta always used to share this line from the Upanishad, that Ananda Brahmani Vidwan na vibheti kadachana. That means it is the Ananda which is the source of life. And once we experience Ananda, then we are not afraid of anyone. And therefore that sense of rebellion is really animated by an experience of the Ananda, the joy of existence in spite of everything. This is a joy, and Ivan continues, this is a joy that has less to do with pleasure, happiness, and optimism, and more to do with an uncompromised freedom of conscience. And that is so important to understand Chitta. and a clarity of understanding, with the plenitude of being who one is, fully and without adulteration, and with the power born by this. It is Spinoza's joy, and we can add, it is Chitta Bhai's joys, and it is a joy of us, all of us fellow travelers. So it is a joy to welcome Ivan, and we very eagerly and with gratitude look forward to listen to you. My request is that in our community of coexistence today, we have some friends from Odisha who are enriched by a little bit of translation of your, oration, your presentation. So, with with your kind, consideration, after you speak for 20 minutes or so, I will spend 5 minutes or so in translating, and then another talk. So, Ivan, please.
Do you want me to speak for how many minutes?
You can kindly speak for 40 to 45 minutes.
No, I mean like before I let you translate.
Maybe 15 to 20 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you to everybody for attending this lecture. And thank you for Ananta for inviting me. Like he said, I've met him in 2008, and it's been many years of doing things and simply many years in the ups and downs of life. So it's very good to see him again and to be able to participate with him in something after about a year or two that the pandemic just simply put everybody in their corners. I came up with an idea of trying to draw some parallels between Albert Camus and Chitta Bai. After I came up with the idea, and even while I had the idea, I knew that this was going to be difficult because for two reasons. One, I tend to be a systematic thinker, and Camus is not a systematic thinker. And Camus is not a systematic thinker for philosophical reasons. And hence one cannot simply bypass that issue. Furthermore, when you try to draw comparisons between two things or two people, what tends to happen is there's always a tendency that you will try to define one person in terms of the other, or vice versa, which paradoxically, or let's just use the word paradoxically, in the end, it ends up obscuring one of the two members of the binome. You turn to identify one in terms of the other, and then the mutuality, it's difficult to maintain. So once I got myself in this mess, I started to wonder how I get myself out of the mess. So what I ended up doing is just to try to choose some themes that were in a way external to the persons, and to try to explore them together with the two of them. The last thing that I'll say about this and about the title is that the term rebellion is also a term that has a lot of nuances, and it is in a sense ill-conceived. So I'm also going to be dealing with a term that in itself has certain layers of ambiguity. But I'll start. I think Chitta Bai and Camus, they both lived times that were oddly similar. Chitta Bai was in India while the independence movement was happening. It was a time of great upheaval, and it was an upheaval that had moral dimensions, like many upheavals have. And Camus was in France, And he was in the middle of the Second World War, which was also a great upheaval with great moral stakes. The war ended and independence was achieved, political independence was achieved in India. And like many time periods after great events, there is a tendency for people to think that this is the beginning of something, that those events ended up being great harbingers of things to come. So people have great expectations about new beginnings. However, the cunning of history tends to indicate that in many cases, those great events that involve great sacrifices and that open up great possibilities end up narrowing themselves down and end up returning to a new version of the old status quo. And different thinkers take different approaches to that, that state of affairs. I believe that a lot of the work of Camus and a lot of the work of Chitta, certainly the work that has political dimensions, is one of a type of rebellion against that closing down of possibilities. And in fact, I would say that for both of them, the task of a person of conscience is precisely not only a continuing development of their own self, but also a permanent rebellion against that closing of possibilities, not only of personal development, but of collective development. Interestingly enough, Chitta ended up living in Europe during these times of the post-war, the war and the post-war, and he found three philosophers that resonated with him, and these three philosophers were Spinoza, Kierkegaard, and Camus, and you see them being talked about in his writings. And I find interesting that the choices, because these three thinkers, these three European thinkers, are without any doubt what we would call radical thinkers. Not radical in the sense of like political radicalism, but radical more like what we, I guess, would call existentially radical, like in a way, quote unquote, truly radical. There's a lot of ways of trying to define what these people were doing or were about. I think one of the ways that is simple, but actually quite useful, is just to put them in the tradition that Spinoza, I think, came out of, which is the tradition that what people call free thinkers. And free thinkers were people that were questioning the traditional ideas of society and the traditional ideas of religion. And they come out of the Renaissance and they come out of the early Enlightenment, and they belong to an underground movement across Europe, mostly a movement that operated outside of institutions. They all paid a very high price for what they did. They all bore it well in their own different ways. And I think Chitta felt a type of kindredness to these people. In the case of Camus, what one finds when one looks at his life events is that this is an individual that invested himself in the war and committed himself to the French resistance at all levels, and took great risks like everybody else that was part of the French resistance. He became a exemplar of moral courage and progressive engagement during the war. However, when the war ended, he ended up taking a position that was minoritarian. He ended up taking a position that many people from the left, many people that consider themselves radical and progressive, found to be oddly out of tune with their spirit. He became, to some extent, ostracized, and to a great extent, highly criticized by the left, because all of a sudden he was subscribing to positions that they found to be non-orthodox, and positions that they found to be non-committed to the main movement, so to speak. And I believe that a lot of like the work that Camus did after the war was work that occupies that particular space, that space of like working against the grain, and in a way criticizing what had become of the events of the war and the aftermath of the possibilities of continuing a collective development, and just basically running with that event of history. The way that Camus expresses this is in a different way. For example, if you look at the book The Rebel, what you find is a critique of a type of mentality. And the mentality in that book, he expresses it as a mentality that has to do with like a type of metaphysical attitude, he calls it. And by what he means by this at the most simplest level is that many thinkers, and now he's actually criticizing progressive thinkers, or what you and I might call revolutionary thinkers. He finds that these people end up taking certain ideas that start out as distillates of reality and reifying them and making the ideal to be the ultimate measurement of reality. And for him, this is problematic because when you take an idea and you enshrine it like that, that idea very quickly becomes one where people need to be at the service of the idea instead of the idea being at the service of people. And he thinks that that is not only the beginning or the definition of totalitarianism, but he believes that this is the beginning and definition of oppression. And hence a lot of his work can be seen as an effort to continually chip away at this kind of like phantoms that oppress people. And that's why in the end, he decided to go against ideas of revolution. And instead of like aligning himself with like the revolution with a capital R, he decided to align himself with rebellion, which I think for him, the word rebellion was kind of like a non-metaphysical word. It's a tinier word. It's a more low-key word. Interestingly enough, he put this concretely by saying that he doesn't think that the changes in history have been the result of great political programs or out of like the great development of like great ideas like socialism with capital S or communism with capital C, but that actually they come out of people's organizing efforts at a very low level. And hence he thought that a lot of the gains of certainly the 20th century were gains that were not to be assigned to the Communist Party or to the revolution, but that were to be assigned to trade unions and syndicates. And he thought that that was the level where reality really had liberatory potential. I think here is where one can then start building a bridge between Camus and the work of Chitta, because in the work of Chitta, what you see is a similar situation, an individual that belonged to the generation, in a way, to the generation after the generation of independence. You know, he was a very young man, or, you know, at least a young man when independence happened. And in a way, he was the type of individual that was trying to complete the liberation, so to speak. Independence was a political victory, and he thought that the task now was a task to complete that liberation and extend it to the social domain and to the cultural domain. So the idea was that liberation is a totality, and that political liberation is not enough, but it needs to be accompanied by social and by cultural freedom. Interestingly enough, for him, one of the very first things that one needed to do to undertake this, to complete this task, was to take stock of the Indian cultural heritage, because he thought that in all the traditions of all the regions of India lay the identity of India and the potential of India, the potential that needed to be fully realized. So in a way, it reminds me of Gandhi, that when he returned from South Africa, well, you see this in the autobiography, but I'm sure all of you know it anyway. He took a long journey all around India because he wanted to, like, absorb the whole subcontinent, because he thought that in order to work for India's freedom, he needed to know India. And the only way to know India was to witness and experience India. So he spent many months just traveling around before he sat in a corner and then started in earnest, so to speak. I think this leads us to another thing that is important, and another way of understanding Camus' anti-metaphysical attitude, which is that Camus said that his anti-metaphysical attitude ended up not only putting ideas at the service of people instead of vice versa, but that for him, the universal was only shorthand for the particular. So for him, when we fight for humanity, we are just fighting for individual people, and that the idea of humanity only has any value because every single human being has value. So the locus of value is not humanity with capital H. The locus of value is the individual human. He or she is the object, the being that has value, and then humanity as a concept acquires value because it is representative of particulars that have, in a way, infinite value. And I think Chitta Bai's mentality is a very similar one. He's always operating at the level of the ground, so to speak. He thinks that the ground is the source of truth, the ground is the source of real potential, and the ground is the source of liberation. And at the ground is where actually real people are living with real sufferings and with real potentials that need to be actualized, or at least, like, you know, potentiated so that they can be actualized. And hence, you know, a lot of his life was spent doing two things. One, doing archaeological and archival work to extract and to make current again as many strands as possible of like Indian community wisdom. He thought that this was important because he thought that during colonialism, a lot of that stuff ended up being at least occluded by the colonial program and by the Western colonial ideals. And hence, in a way, before post-colonialism ever existed, you have already an individual that is engaged in this particular task. He didn't call it anything like that. He didn't use those big words. For him, it was the idea is like, if you want to liberate India, or like Indian communities, or like Indian provinces, the way to do it is, first of all, go back to the sources and revive them if they need to be revived, make them current again, and then you can take it from there again. This can be understood as actually also fighting processes of modernization. I mean, Gandhi talked about that a lot. But I want to emphasize that Chitta was not an anti-modernist. He thought that actually the Enlightenment and modernism have good ideas and that there are good values therein. So his idea was not to simply become an anti-European and anti-modernist, like, you know, nativist. The idea was that India has its own traditions that have value in terms of, like, you know, human biodiversity at the level of the planet, and that Europeans have good ideas too, and that the task is actually both to revive and to re-strengthen the Indian traditions, while at the same time using and keeping the ideas from Western world and from the Enlightenment that can be of use. One last thing that I will say is that he did believe that although you need to start locally, and that the sources of local wisdom are the starting points and are the locus of any cultural ferment, he thought that all those ideas in the end, at the very last instance, do contribute to what you and I would call universal culture. He thought that works of true value have universal value, you know, and hence he also translated a lot of what you and I would call world literatures into, you know, non-hegemonic languages of India. So he thought that both things needed to be done at once. The other component, obviously, is the component of integral education, and I will stop there for a second so that Ananta can do what he needs to do.
So, mucho gracias.
Yeah.
And vielen Dank aus meine Herz. So lovely, and it is so lovely and so insightful. The bridge that you are nurturing, the bridge that you are weaving, and we really embrace you. And Chitta Bhai also is very happy to meet with you, and you know, he's giving you a hug. And amaro bhai bhoni mane am sangre Ivan achanti, Ivan Marquez. से जने भारी गभीर दर्शन अन्वेषक एवं से तांकर एई वक्तव्य रे से कहउछंती अल्बर्ट कामू बोली जने गभीर चिंताविद आ योद्धा एवं लेखक थिले तांको सहित चित्त भाई एवं तांकर दुई जनकर साधना को तांकर संग्राम को एका संगरे भाबिबा को हमको आह्वान एवं आमंत्रण दउछन एवं जते बेला आमे एका संगरे भाबू से गोटे भारी दार्शनिक प्रश्नटी आम आगे प्रस्थापना करछंती आमे जते बेला दुई जन को एका संगरे भाबू बेले बेले जानतरे बा अजानतरे आमे जन को आउ जन को निकुतिरे तौलो एवं एटा गोटे भारी माने एटा गोटे अस्तित्वगत प्रश्न तेणु ताकू उत्तरण करबा को हेले से गोटे भारी सुंदर पथटिए से आम आगे उपस्थापना करछंती जे एमिति केछि जीवनर प्रश्न को नेकी आमे दुई जन आमर सहयात्री को बुझिबा को चेष्टा करिबा अल्बर्ट कामू एवं चित्त भाई एवं ए प्रश्न मानक भितर गुटे होछि जे जते बेले ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ଏବଂ ଆଲବର୍ଟ କାମୁ ତାଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ସମୟଟା ଗୋଟେ ଭାରି ଆମୂଳଚୂଳ ପରିବର୍ତ୍ତନର ସମୟ ଥିଲା। ଯେମିତି ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ବିଶ୍ୱଯୁଦ୍ଧରେ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଫ୍ରାନ୍ସକୁ ହିଟଲର ଏବଂ ଜର୍ମାନୀ କବଳିତ କରିଦେଇଥିଲା, ସେତେବେଳେ ଯେଉଁ ରେଜିଷ୍ଟାନ୍ସ ମୁଭମେଣ୍ଟ ହଉଥିଲା, ଆଉ ସେଇଥିରେ ଆଲବର୍ଟ କାମୁ ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ ଥିଲେ। ଆଉ ଠିକ୍ ସେମିତି ଭାରି ବଡ଼ ପରିବର୍ତ୍ତନ। ଏବଂ ଆମର ସେତେବେଳେ ବି ଭାରତ ଛାଡ଼ ଆନ୍ଦୋଳନ, ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ଆପଣମାନେ ଜାଣିଥିବେ ସେ ରେଭେନ୍ସା କଲେଜ ଛାଡ଼ି ଜେଲ ବରଣ କରିଥିଲେ ଏବଂ ଜେଲରେ ହିଁ ସେ କେତେ ସୃଜନଶୀଳ ହେଇଥିଲେ। ଜେଲଟା ତାଙ୍କ ପାଇଁ ଗୋଟେ ଶିକ୍ଷଣର ଭୂମି ଥିଲା। କିନ୍ତୁ ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପରେ ଯେଉଁ ସ୍ୱପ୍ନଭଙ୍ଗ ଘଟିଲା, ଆଉ ଆମର ଇଭାନ ତାକୁ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଭାବରେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇ ସ୍ୱପ୍ନଭଙ୍ଗଟା କ'ଣ ଥିଲା? ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ପରିବର୍ତ୍ତନ ଭିତରେ ଗୋଟେ ସମ୍ଭାବନାର କେତେ ଦିଗ୍ବଳୟ ଉନ୍ମୋଚିତ ହଉଥିଲା। କିନ୍ତୁ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ବିଶ୍ୱଯୁଦ୍ଧ ପରେ ଏବଂ ଭାରତ ବର୍ଷର ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପରେ ସେଇ ସମ୍ଭାବନା ଗୁଡ଼ାକ ପୁଣି ତାଙ୍କ ହାତରେ ଗୋଡ଼ରେ ସବୁ ଗଣ୍ଠି ବସିଗଲା, ବନ୍ଧନ ହେଇଗଲା, ଆଉ ବେଡ଼ ବସିଗଲା। ଦେ ୱେଆର ଇନ୍ ଚେଞ୍ଜ। ତେଣୁ ସେମାନଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ରିବେଲିୟନ, ଯେଉଁ ଗୋଟେ ବିଦ୍ରୋହ, ସେ ବିଦ୍ରୋହଟା କ'ଣ ଥିଲା? ଗୋଟେ ପକ୍ଷରେ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତି ତାର ବିକାଶ ପାଇଁ ଉଦ୍ୟମ କରିବ, ଆଉ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ପକ୍ଷରେ ସମାଜ ଏବଂ ରାଜନୀତି କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ଯେଉଁ ସମ୍ଭାବନାଟା ଫୁଟି ଉଠିବାର ଥିଲା, ସେଇ ସମ୍ଭାବନା ଗୁଡ଼ରେ ଯାହା କିଛି ହବାର ଥିଲା। ଯେମିତି ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ତାଙ୍କର ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରବଞ୍ଚିତ ବିପ୍ଳବ ପ୍ରବନ୍ଧରେ ଲେଖିଛନ୍ତି, ବିପ୍ଳବ ହବାର ଥିଲା କିନ୍ତୁ ସେଟା ପ୍ରବଞ୍ଚିତ ହେଇଗଲା। ବିଟ୍ରେୟଲ ଅଫ ରିଭଲ୍ୟୁସନ, ଯେଉଁଟା ସେ ଗୁନାର ମିଡାଲଙ୍କ ଠାରୁ ଆଣିକି ଲେଖିଥିଲେ। ତେଣୁ ଏଇଟା ରିବେଲିୟନର ଗୋଟେ କ'ଣ ନା, ଯେଉଁ ସମ୍ଭାବନା ଯେଉଁ ସଂକୋଚନ ଘଟୁଛି, ତା ସହିତ ଆଉ ଇଭାନ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ଯେଉଁ ୟୁରୋପୀୟ ଯେଉଁ 3 ଜଣ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ସ୍ପିନୋଜା, କିର୍କେଗାର୍ଡ ଏବଂ କାମୁ, ତାଙ୍କୁ ଭାରି ଆତ୍ମୀୟ ଲାଗିଲା। ଏବଂ କ'ଣ ପାଇଁ ଆତ୍ମୀୟ ଲାଗିଲା? ଯେ ଏମାନେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ 3 ଜଣ ସେରା ରେଡିକାଲ ଥିଙ୍କର, ଗୋଟେ ବିପ୍ଳବୀ ଚିନ୍ତାବିଦ। ବିପ୍ଳବୀ ଏଇ ଦୃଷ୍ଟିରୁ ଯେ ସେମାନେ କେବଳ ରାଜନୈତିକ ବିପ୍ଳବ କଥା କହୁନଥିଲେ, ଗୋଟେ ଅସ୍ତିତ୍ୱର ବିପ୍ଳବ। ଆମ ଅସ୍ତିତ୍ୱ କେମିତି ଗୋଟେ ବିପ୍ଳବ ମୁଖର ହେଇଯିବ, କୌଣସି କଥାକୁ ମାନି ନବନି, କୌଣସି ଅମର୍ଯ୍ୟାଦାକୁ ମାନି ନବନି। ଏବଂ ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ, ସେଇଥିପାଇଁ ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ 3 ଜଣ ଚିନ୍ତାବିଦ, ଆଉ ଇଭାନ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେଉଁ ଫ୍ରି ଥିଙ୍କର, ଯେଉଁ ମୁକ୍ତ ଚିନ୍ତାବିଦ ମାନେ ୟୁରୋପରେ ଥିଲେ, ସେମାନେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ବ୍ୟବସ୍ଥା ବିରୁଦ୍ଧରେ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ କରୁଥିଲେ ଏବଂ ସେଥିପାଇଁ ସେମାନଙ୍କୁ ଅନେକ ଯାତନା ସହ୍ୟ କରିବାକୁ ପଡ଼ିଛି। କିନ୍ତୁ ଏଇ ଭିତରେ ସେମାନେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଜୀବନର ଗୀତ ଗାଇଛନ୍ତି। ଆଉ କାମୁଙ୍କ ବିଷୟରେ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ବିଶ୍ୱଯୁଦ୍ଧରେ କାମୁ ଏତେ ମାନେ ପ୍ରତିବାଦ କଲେ ଆଉ ସଂଗ୍ରାମ କଲେ, ତାପରେ ସେ ଯେଉଁ ପୋଜିସନଟେ ନେଲେ, ସେଟା କେବଳ ତଥାକଥିତ ଲେଫ୍ଟ ବା ଗୋଟେ ବାମପନ୍ଥୀ ବା ତଥାକଥିତ ମାର୍କସିଷ୍ଟ ବିପ୍ଳବର କଥାଟି ନଥିଲା। ସେ କହୁଥିଲେ ଯେ ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ଲୋକ, ଯେ ମଣିଷ, ଯେଉଁ ଗୋଟେ ଆମର ଗୋଟେ ଆଇଡିଆଜ ଅଛି, ଯେଉଁ ବିପ୍ଳବର କଥାଟିଏ ରହିଛି, ସେଇ ବିପ୍ଳବର କଥାଟି ମଣିଷ ପାଖରେ ଆସି ମଣିଷର କାମରେ ଲାଗିବ। କିନ୍ତୁ ମଣିଷ ଗୋଟେ ବିପ୍ଳବ ବୈପ୍ଳବିକ ଆଇଡିଆର ଭୃତ୍ୟ ହେଇଯିବନି। ଆମେ ଜାଣିଥିବା ଯେ ସୋସିଆଲିଜମ, କମ୍ୟୁନିଜମ, ନ୍ୟାସନାଲିଜମ, ଏଇସବୁ ଆଇଡିଆଜକୁ ମଣିଷକୁ କେମିତି ଭୃତ୍ୟ କରିଦେଇଛି। ନ୍ୟାସନାଲ ସୋସିଆଲିଜମ, ହିଟଲର ମଣିଷକୁ ଗୋଟେ ଗୋରୁ ପଲ କରିକି କେମିତି ଗୁଡ଼େଇ ଗୁଡ଼େଇ ମାରିଲେ, ଆଉ ଠିକ୍ ସେମିତି ଷ୍ଟାଲିନ ଏବଂ ଏମାନେ ସମସ୍ତେ। ତେଣୁ ଏହାକୁ ଆଲବର୍ଟ କାମୁ ଏଣ୍ଟି ମେଟାଫିଜିକାଲ ଆଇଡିଆ ବୋଲି କହୁଛନ୍ତି। ଏଇଟା ଗୋଟେ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର କଥା, କାହିଁକି ଅନେକ ମହତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ ଦର୍ଶନ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ, ଜୀବନ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ଯେଉଁ ନୂଆ ନୂଆ ସବୁ ଉଦ୍ୟମ ଆସିଛି, ନୂଆ ନୂଆ ପ୍ରୟାସ ଆସିଛି, ଏମିତି ଗୋଟେ ମେଟାଫିଜିକାଲ ଆଇଡିଆ ବିରୁଦ୍ଧରେ, ଯେ ଏଇଟା ହିଁ ଏକମାତ୍ର ସତ୍ୟ। ତାପରେ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ କଥାଟି, ଯେ ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ବିପ୍ଳବ କଥାଟି, ଆଉ ଇଭାନ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର, ଏତେ ଗଭୀର ଭାବରେ ସେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କୁ ବୁଝିଛନ୍ତି। ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଠିକ୍ ସେମିତି ଭାରତ ବର୍ଷରେ ଯେତେବେଳେ ସ୍ୱାଧୀନତା ପରେ ସବୁ ବିପ୍ଳବ ମାନ ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରକାର ଗୁମ୍ଫା ଭିତରେ ପଶିଗଲା, କିନ୍ତୁ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ସେଇ ଯେଉଁ ଲିବରେସନ, ସେଇ ଯେଉଁ ମୁକ୍ତି ସଂଗ୍ରାମକୁ ତାକୁ ସମ୍ପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ କରିବାକୁ ପ୍ରୟାସୀ ହେଇଥିଲେ। ଏବଂ ସେ ମୁକ୍ତିଟା କେବଳ ପଲିଟିକାଲ ବା ରାଜନୈତିକ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ସୀମିତ ନ ରହି ତାହା କେମିତି ସାମାଜିକ ଏବଂ ସାଂସ୍କୃତିକ ଭୂମିକୁ ଆସିବ। ଏବଂ ସେଥିପାଇଁ ସେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଏକ ଯାତ୍ରା ରେ ସେ ନିଜକୁ ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ କରିଥିଲେ। ଆମେ ଜାଣିଥିବା ଯେ ଏଇ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ଇଭାନ ଗାନ୍ଧୀଙ୍କ କଥା କହୁଛନ୍ତି। ଗାନ୍ଧୀ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଭାରତବର୍ଷ ଆସିଲେ କେମିତି ପାଦରେ ସାରା ଭାରତବର୍ଷ ବୁଲିଲେ। ଆଉ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ସେମିତି କେତେ ଭ୍ରମଣ କରିଛନ୍ତି। ଗଞ୍ଜାମ ମାଳରେ 7 ଦିନ, ନେପାଳ ପଥେ, ଭାରତରେ କୋଣେ ଅନୁକୋଣେ ସେ ଭ୍ରମଣ କରିଛନ୍ତି, ଗାଁ ଗାଁ ମାନଙ୍କରେ। ଏଇ ଗୋଟେ ଭ୍ରମଣ। ଆଉ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ କଥାଟି ହଉଛି ଯୋଉଟା କି ଇଭାନ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଅନ୍ତର୍ଦୃଷ୍ଟିର ସହିତ କହୁଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇଟା ହଉଛି ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମର ପରମ୍ପରାରେ ଆମ ଭିତରେ ଯାହା କିଛି ରହିଛି ସଂଗୁପ୍ତ ହେଇକି ରହିଛି, ତାକୁ ଆମେ କେମିତି ଆର୍କିଓଲୋଜିଷ୍ଟ ମାନେ ଯେମିତି ପ୍ରତ୍ନତତ୍ତ୍ୱବିତ୍ ମାନେ ଯାଆନ୍ତି ଗୋଟେ ଜାଗାରେ ଗୋଟେ ଜିନିଷଟେ ଲୁଚି ରହିଛି, କେତେ କେତେ ତାର ପ୍ରସ୍ତର ହେଇଛି, ତାକୁ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଉନ୍ମୋଚନ କରି ତା ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ହୀରା ରହିଛି, ଯୋଉ ମୋତି ରହିଛି, ଆମକୁ ଆବିଷ୍କାର କରିବାକୁ ହୁଏ। ଠିକ ସେମିତି ଆମେ ଜାଣିଥିବା ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ତାଙ୍କର ପ୍ରାରମ୍ଭିକ କାମମାନ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ସାଂସ୍କୃତିକ ପ୍ରତ୍ନତତ୍ତ୍ୱ, ଯେମିତି ଅଚ୍ୟୁତାନନ୍ଦ ଦାସ ପଞ୍ଚସଖା ଧର୍ମ, ଓଡ଼ିଶାର ମହିମା ଧର୍ମ। ତେଣୁ ଏଇ ସବୁ ଧର୍ମ ପରମ୍ପରା ଭିତରେ ଯେଉଁ ଗୋଟେ ମାନବ ମୁକ୍ତିର ଯେଉଁ ପଥଟିଏ ରହିଛି, ତାକୁ କେମିତି ଆମେ ଅନୁଭବ କରିବା। ତେଣୁ ଏଇ ଭିତରେ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ କଥା ଗଭୀର ଭାବରେ ଇଭାନ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ଆଧୁନିକ ସମାଜ ସହିତ ସେ ଯୁକ୍ତ ହେଇକି ପରମ୍ପରାରୁ ରତ୍ନ ସଞ୍ଚୟ କରି ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ଏବଂ ଭବିଷ୍ୟତ ପାଇଁ ଗୋଟେ ନୂତନ ପଥ ନିର୍ମାଣ କରିବାକୁ ପ୍ରୟାସୀ ହେଇଛନ୍ତି। ସେ କିନ୍ତୁ ଆଧୁନିକତା ବିରୋଧୀ ନୁହନ୍ତି। ଏଇଟା ଗୋଟେ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର କଥା। ହି ୱାଜ ନଟ୍ ଏଣ୍ଟି ମଡର୍ନ, ଏବଂ କାହିଁକି ସେ ମଡର୍ଣ୍ଣିଟିରୁ ଅନେକ ପ୍ରେରଣା ପାଇଛନ୍ତି। ଏବଂ ଏହି କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି, ଇଭାନ ଭାରି କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ସାଧନାଟି ଥିଲା ଯେ ଆମର ସଂସ୍କୃତି ଭିତରେ କ'ଣ ସବୁ ରହିଛି, ଯେଉଁଗୁଟା କି ଶାଶ୍ୱତ ରହିଛି, ଯେଉଁଗୁଡାକ ଆମର ଜୀବନ ଉତ୍ତୋଳନକାରୀ ରହିଛି, ଠିକ ସେମିତି ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ସଂସ୍କୃତି ଭିତରେ, ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ଚିନ୍ତା ଭିତରେ ଅନେକ ଜୀବନ ଉତ୍ତୋଳନକାରୀ ଉପାଦାନ ମାନ ରହିଛି। ତେଣୁ ଏଇ ଜୀବନ ଉତ୍ତୋଳନକାରୀ ଉପାଦାନ ମାନ ଯେ ଯୋଉଠି ନା କାହିଁକି ତାର ଏକ ମାନବୀୟ ୟୁନିଭର୍ସାଲ ଭ୍ୟାଲ୍ୟୁ, ଗୋଟେ ସାର୍ବଜନୀନ ମୂଲ୍ୟବୋଧ ରହିଛି। ସେଇଥିପାଇଁ ଆମେ ଯେ ଯୋଉଠି ଥାଉ, ଆମେ ଭାରତରେ ଥାଉ ବା ପାଶ୍ଚାତ୍ୟରେ ଥାଉ, ଯୋଉଠି ଜୀବନ ମୁକ୍ତି ପାଇଁ ପ୍ରୟାସ ହେଇଛି, ଚିନ୍ତନ ହେଇଛି, ସେଇ ସବୁକୁ ନେଇକି ହିଁ ଗୋଟେ ୟୁନିଭର୍ସାଲ କଲଚର ସୃଷ୍ଟି ହଉଛି। ତେଣୁ ଏତିକି ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ Ivanଙ୍କର କଥା. So this was my translation, Ivan, and I just wanted to just share this possible link that this anti-metaphysical attitude in Camus and later on might be thought together with the critique of the metaphysical, in European philosophical tradition, starting from Heidegger to Derrida, and some little possible border crossing there. But please, looking forward to yours.
Okay. So I'm gonna build a bridge between like the work of like cultural recovery and cultural cultivation and the idea of education, the idea of what you call integral education. And because I think, I shouldn't just simply say one and the other, I should actually make people understand that these two things are, from his point of view, just part and parcel of like just one single thing. But in order to understand that, one has to redefine what the idea of culture is. Traditionally, long time ago, or what now seems like a long time ago, culture was a code word for high culture, elite culture, like Brahmin culture, or intellectual culture, what have you, high art. There've been a lot of different efforts to collapse the distinction between high and low. The one that I find most useful for our purposes is the one that actually comes from anthropology. In anthropology, we have a broader notion of culture, which culture is simply the practices, both symbolic and otherwise, that constitute a form of life of a particular community. And it can include language, it can include like technology, it can include like social arrangements, you name it. And with this definition of culture, what one does is that one creates a bridge between Chitta Bai's interest in books, just to give it a term, and interest in language, and his interest in like communities. Because for him, those books are simply distillates of some emanations of community life. And hence, in the best case scenario, what they are is codifications and symbolic representations of cultural practices that are the part and parcel of life, and also the real sources of human development. In the 21st century and in the 20th century, the Latin American anthropologist Nestor Garcia Canclini coined the term material cultures, culturas materiales. And what he was making is a very similar claim. What he was making was the claim that when we understand culture, we shouldn't try to understand it as something like, you know, highfalutin, but that actually culture is simply, you know, the human efforts at living a human life, both at the symbolic level and at the material level. And if you really push it, you wouldn't even make a distinction between the symbolic and the material. But I will leave that aside because that would be very complicated and very time consuming to make that point. But be it as it may, for Chitta Bai, that establishes a bridge between him as a writer and him as a community educator, just to give it a term. Again, if the emphasis is on the particular rather than on like big abstract ideas, then change is going to happen at that level of the particular. And for him, changes happen in human interaction between individuals. You know, I create possibilities for you to develop your potential, and you create possibilities for me. It's a type of mutuality. And yeah, there might be some relationships of facilitation, or there might be some relationships of mentorship, but they are there's nothing complicated about it. It is simply part of what we call, like, you know, a type of hermeneutical life. You know, it's basically human collective life reproducing itself. And the way we do that is like new creatures are born, and they are brought up into the system, so to speak. And then those people learn to develop their basic competencies by internalizing the cultural practices that have taken literally thousands of years to codify and to embody. And yeah, then later as individuals, and even from the beginning, they will always bring their own spark, and they will always bring their own particular fire to weld, you know, the new cultural forms. And hence there can be creativity, but there cannot be creativity ex nihilo, in vacuo. Creativity is always working with the material that is available. And in this case, the material that is available to a great extent is actually cultural material. It's like the previous strata of historical historical activity of human life. So his integral schools were based in communities, and they were holistic. So they included all kinds of activities of community organizing, activities of like literacy, activities of the collective decision-making, activities even of construction, all kinds of activities that you and I would call like, you know, spiritual development. You know, they were all part and parcel of the same thing, because for him, human potential is multifarious. We develop in all kinds of different ways, and hence all kinds of different activities enable that development. We have a lot of portals for human actualization of human potential. And I want to mention something here at this particular place, which is that I think one way to understand better the particular type of perspective that Chitta had is by understanding what for him was the relationship between the individual and the divine. And I think the best way to understand that is actually to go back and understand his relationship to Spinoza. I mean, I'm sure that this can also be done by understanding his relationship to, like, you know, to certain thinkers from the Indian tradition, but Spinoza will do. Spinoza, if you know anything about him, is a Western philosopher who, broadly speaking, embraced what has now been called a type of pantheism. The idea that God is just a word that is shorthand for simply a type of understanding of the universe in all its totality, and it's all in its complete capacity of potential. So God is simply a code term for understanding the universe as in its full potential, and also understanding the universe as if it was already fully actualized, if all that potential was already fully actualized. But Spinoza, in his relentless logic, understood by a process of inference that what that actually means is that you and I, being parts of the cosmos, in a very concrete way, you and I are cosmic dust. We are not part of the cosmos in any kind of metaphorical way. We're not part of the cosmos in any kind of like mysterious way. We are stuff, and we are the same stuff as everything else, or at least we have the same source. And hence, whatever God is, we have the same animus. We have the same spark. We are also a miniature microcosm of that same cosmic dynamic. And therefore, you and I are divine in a very concrete way, but also in a very non-mysterious way. You and I are divine because you and I, just to use terminology that probably I shouldn't, we are embodiments of the logos, just like the universe is an embodiment of the logos, you know, at large. We're just simply a smaller part of it. You know, one thing that might help, although again, it's like mixing traditions, but I think it creates an image that I think it's powerful. In the Chinese language, there is an abundance of what they call mass nouns. Mass noun is a type of word that doesn't relate to the particulars as if it was a universal and a particular. It relates to the particular as part versus whole. So for example, when I say, can you give me a glass of water? In English, for instance, the word water doesn't relate to a particular versus the universal water. When I say, give me a glass of water, what I'm telling you is just give me one small part of all the water that is in the world. So the notion, the concept water is not an abstract universal, Platonic universal. The concept water is simply shorthand for the totality of water that there is. And when you give me a glass, you're just giving me a tiny bit of it. But there is no metaphysical distinction between the tiny bit of water that you gave me and all the water that there is that is represented by the concept water. Why is this important? This is important because there are a bunch of other concepts that are mass nouns. In the Chinese language, humanity is also a mass noun. So when you and I say that we're humans, it's not that we're particular representatives of a universal, it's that we are a tiny chunk of all the human that there is. And why is this important? Well, this is important because it allows us to try to understand how is it that these people can be so committed to the individual and to the particular, while at the same time preserving an idea that we are all representatives of something universal. we're representative of something universal, not because of some sort of mysterious metaphysical thing. We're representatives of the universal because we're a tiny bit of the universal. We're just a part of it. We're like a grain of sand part of it. So in a way, obviously, for Chitta Bai, the type of cultural work that he was engaged in, which was mostly what he would call human development, was an effort to simply actualize human potentiality, but ultimately by actualizing or optimizing the possibilities of human actualization of every single particular human. Because you and I are simply embodiments of what humanity at large as a group can achieve. And hence, you know, for him, just like for Camus, it makes no sense to think about sacrificing any individual for the collective or sacrificing any individual for the sake of humanity. Humanity is just a term for all the individuals that there are. So whenever you sacrifice an individual for humanity, you end up sacrificing a part of humanity for the rest of humanity. And in the worst case scenario, you end up sacrificing a big chunk of all those humans for the sake of a smaller chunk of humans. And that's obviously the beginning of oppression, right? You know, when you decide that some humans are more worthy than others, and some humans are more equal than others, and some humans are going to achieve their potential at the expense of the achievement of the potential of other humans. And for him, this will be completely non-liberatory, being both for Camus and for Chitta Bai. In the end, there are no shortcuts. Then, unfortunately, there's not going to be any political program that is going to bring change from above in some magical way. Change happens always painstakingly, slowly, and piecemeal. India or the planet Earth will be a better place, one interaction at a time, you know, and 1 second at a time. Like I like to say myself, the kingdom of God is a performative event, and it's never an endpoint even. We can construct the kingdom of God for half an hour here. And once I turn on this computer and walk away, the kingdom of God, it's gone until I iterate it elsewhere, outside, next to like the coffee machine or in the bus. So it is a performative. It is not there is no end of history. And hence the work is tireless, unfortunately, because it's a work against a particular kind of entropy, a peculiar type of entropy. The ideas of integral education are not ideas that are original of Chitta Bai. Ideas of integral education were floating around everywhere around the world during these decades that he was interested in them. He found them in, obviously he found them in Denmark, with the work of like Leopold Kohr. With the work, that's not Leopold Kohr. The work of like the folk educator in Denmark. What is the name of that individual, Ananta?
Grundtvig and Christian Kohl.
That's it. Thank you. You see them also in movements in France after the war, like for example, worker priests, you know, and red priests that organized in different arrondissements, poor neighborhoods in Paris, and started like community schools or worker schools. You see them in New York City. You know, you see them in Latin America with the work of, you know, Paulo Freire, and also the work of like what they call based communities, Christian-based communities, which were part of like liberation theology. You see them everywhere. It was part of an explosion of true democracy and an explosion of what you and I now tend to call like, you know, civic society, you know. And I think the concept of civic society now has been perverted. And I think that now it's being used in ways that I think are obfuscating, because a lot of things that are called now civic society and great democratic efforts are actually simply human beings organizing themselves for survival strategies. And hence, I find that it's a great perversion of the concept. We live in a time that the nation state completely collapsed. Human beings are left to their own devices. They're sometimes just simply trying to survive by picking up like scrap metal, for instance. And now picking up scrap metal is being redescribed as great examples of civic society or community organizing. And I find that that's a great travesty. I'll finish up talking about rebellion and the idea of the rebel in Camus and in Chitta. Like I told you, for Camus, the rebel is an individual that sees suffering or that experiences suffering in his person. And for him, suffering is not only physical suffering, but also existential suffering, in the sense of like you experiencing that you cannot be fully or even be partially. It's also connected, for Camus, is connected to Kantian ideas that actually you are not regarding me as an end in myself, but simply as a means to an end. And hence you rebel. You basically put a limit to it and you say no. The limit is an interesting point because you say it's a boundary of both. You say no, but also it's a limit in the sense that it's the limit in the sense that also it's a boundary line for your understanding and your perception that you have a whole field of possibility that are not available to you. So in a way, it's a line that does two things. It delimits the limits of being crushed, but also it delimits the reality of oppression and the world of possibility that you're now trying to open up for yourself. You can also open up for you and other people, so for Camus, the work of rebellion is the work of an eternal calling out on those two things, calling out on the limitations and also calling out on a renewal to the task of actualizing the possible and actualizing the potential. And sometimes you do it by questioning or critiquing concrete acts of oppression, and sometimes you do it by questioning and critiquing institutions or ideas that claim to speak for people or claim to speak for humanity, but in the end become ends in themselves and sacrifice people to their own self-perpetuation. And in that regard, that particular facet of this work is similar to the work of the pragmatists, where they're interested in always breaking the crust of convention. Convention is needed because we're hermeneutical creatures, so we need to have a substratum that we can work from. But when the tradition becomes actually confining, then the tradition begins to lose its purpose. And hence tradition by itself, traditionalism, it's not a virtue by itself. There can be good traditions and bad traditions. A lot of the articles that Chitta wrote on social affairs, current affairs, or political current affairs are articles where you see very, very clearly this practice of rebellion. And some of the work that he did in literature, in critique, in literary, what you and I call literary criticism, it's also work that can be seen as work of rebellion. I'll try to talk about the first one first because it's easier, and then if I have time, I'll talk about the second one. This work that he does as a social and political critic is very straightforward critique. And what he basically does is that he says, there is a lot of, well, he does several things. One of the things that he said is like, he says, we claim in word that we're committed to all these changes, But when you look at the behavior of people that make those claims, you actually find out that they're not committed to those claims or to those changes. In a way, it's a shout out to a type of inauthenticity and to a type of hypocrisy. You claim that this is what you are trying to do, but in fact, you're not. So he talks about, you know, politicians. He talks about news pundits. He talks about even sometimes like labor organizers. You claim that you are committed to human development, but your actions speak otherwise. And he's calling out people on what you and I will call basically their bullshit. So that's one thing that he does. Another thing that he does is that he calls out people for abandoning the development of higher, what he might call higher values or more authentically human values at the expense of simply lower human values and in a way less human values. You know, one of the things that he talks about is, for example, materialism. He says materialism has taken over as the main horizon of human effort at creating meaning for themselves. And he tries to show how a lot of efforts in India and elsewhere, a lot of what you and I would have called like the spiritual impulse is being channeled into a culture and a social practice of materialism. He reminds me in that regard a lot of like Paul Tillich, because Paul Tillich talks about idols and God. And for him, for Tillich, money or material possessions are idols. They're not real objects of ultimate concern. They're not real placeholders for the divine. Why? Because they're limited and they limit human development. They're not true horizons of open possibility without limit. So in a lot of these articles on current social and political affairs, what you, I think, see Chitta by doing is actually, again, calling people on their false idols and claiming, oh, you claim that you are engaged in a task of transcendence, but the objects of transcendence that you're aiming for are not true objects of transcendence. They are idols, they're fake. Obviously, he also talks about how money and how commerce and how material gain is always in a very uncomfortable relationship to spiritual striving. If you are dying of hunger, you are not going to be able to strive spiritually because you're dying of hunger. But once you acquire a certain level of human welfare at the level of material possessions and provisions, immediately there is a curve of diminishing returns. Immediately, the commercial endeavors and the material pursuits will get on the way of the development of other facets of your humanity. And he talks about this over and over again. One place that I really like that he talks about this, and in a way it will create a bridge towards the idea of like literally criticism, is that he talks about, you know, folk arts and folk literature. And I find that essay, which is in this book, is one of the most interesting essays, because it is an essay that he says folk literature and folk arts and crafts are very important because they are the site of culture understood as material culture. So if you want to try to like put a finger on the spirit of that particular community, you couldn't find any better place. So he says like we should really promote folk art and we should promote folk literature, and we should also like resuscitate it. We should like reinstate it as of great value, and we should like promote it. But he says we have to figure out how we promote it, because the folk artists shouldn't starve, but once this folk artist becomes an individual that is making commodities to sell in a commodity market, folk art as a side of the spiritual codification of a community starts dying. And what you start producing is literally the art equivalent of an idol. You create simply objects of commercial exchange. And he talks a lot about this. He talks a lot about, look, you know, people claim that, oh, local literatures are wonderful. But he says, yeah, local literatures are wonderful, but not simpliciter. Local literatures are wonderful if they truly represent this cultural ferment of the local community. You can write completely alienating, completely superficial local literature by simply exploiting the local tropes and just writing literature for pure entertainment and just for pure sales, you know. So for him, local in itself is not lofty. You might have something local that is not lofty at all. Like, you know, when you can have some local artists who are just making knickknacks to sell to like tourists, and it doesn't have anything particularly lofty about it. It's no different from the guy next to that person just selling Coca-Cola bottles. You know, it's the same from his own vantage point of spiritual development. It's just the same, you know. Just because you are peddling the local symbols doesn't mean that you're doing great things. But this is very complicated, because what it shows you is that in order to understand the value of a symbol, you cannot simply focus on the symbol. You have to focus on how that symbol will operate in a particular social network and cultural network. And that work is very complicated and is very subtle. And hence, you know, it takes a lot of skill to do well. So those are the things that Chitta Bai did in terms of like rebellion. If you read some of the essays on politics, you see him, you see his, that you can see his fiery spirit. You can see an individual that is actually pretty angry at a lot of the things that he's seeing, which I found quite interesting, because in a lot of the other essays, he seems to be a very placid individual. But what you recognize in those essays is that there's a very, very strong fire that he actually harnesses and tries to keep within certain confines of non-destruction, so to speak. But he is an individual there that you can recognize as an individual that doesn't suffer fools lightly, and an individual that that at the level of perception has very low patience, you know, even though at the level of like human engagement, he might have very high patience, you know. He has high patience with people, but low patience with regards to what he's seeing, you know. And in a way, I think there's a dialectic there. Like his low patience at what he sees, in a way, I think motivates him to engage with high levels of patience with the people, you know, with the people that are displaying things that he has very low patience for, you know. But I find that particular existential place where he puts himself is a very difficult one. A lot of people that have patience, they have patience, period. They have patience for people, and they have patience for people's bullshit. And a lot of people that don't have patience for people bullshit, they just don't have patience for people, period. You know, so to be able to have patience and not patience at the same time in this way, I think it's in itself a spiritual achievement. So yeah, so I think I'm gonna stop there, and I'll, you know, you guys can ask me or do whatever you want.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And your own journey of understanding, it really also provides us an experience of yourself.
Yep.
as a person, as a traveler with life, so insightful indeed. Patience and it is so experiential in the sense that the way you have understood Chitta Bhai almost as a philosophical psychological co-traveler, and Chitta Bhai also brought philosophy and psychology together, and he always used to say therapy, peaceful therapy in the sense that we come together, philosophy, psychology, literature, and we heal ourselves and elevate ourselves, and not really, patience does not mean being patient with the degradation of life, and you have put it so beautifully. Again, with generosity of you and friends, I'll make a brief translation of it.
Of course.
And in the meantime, dear friends, those of you like to ask a question, please share through chat box, and I request Randhir to help us to take a note. And as people are presenting their thoughts in the chat box, I request Gyan Luigi and some friends present already. I request them to kindly prepare their thoughts. Gyan Luigi, Anil Bhai, Minati, and then we have some new friends with us. For example, I see Parhat Durani, Supriya Singh. You kindly prepare your thoughts for 1 or 2 minutes, and other friends, please put your chat. ତେଣୁ ଆମର ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀ ମାନେ ଏଇ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟାୟରେ ଆଉ ଇଭାନ ଭାରି ମହତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ କଥା ସବୁ କହୁଛନ୍ତି। ସେ କଥାଟି ହଉଛି ଯେ ପ୍ରଥମ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟାୟରେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ କଥା, ଗୋଟେ ସାଂସ୍କୃତିକ ପୁନର୍ଜାଗରଣ, ସାଂସ୍କୃତିକ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ, ସାହିତ୍ୟିକ ଏବଂ ସାଂସ୍କୃତିକ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ, ତା ସହିତ ଗୋଟେ ଶିକ୍ଷାଗତ ଯେଉଁ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ, ଆଉ ଶିକ୍ଷା ଏବଂ ସାଂସ୍କୃତିକ ଜାଗରଣ ଅଙ୍ଗାଙ୍ଗୀ ଭାବେ ଜଡ଼ିତ। ତାହେଲେ ସଂସ୍କୃତିକୁ ଆମେ କେମିତି ବୁଝିବା, ଏବଂ ସେଇ କଥାକୁ କହିକି ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଅନେକ ସମୟରେ ସଂସ୍କୃତି କହିଲେ ଗୋଟେ ବଡ଼ ପଣ୍ଡାର ସଂସ୍କୃତି, ଗୋଟେ ବ୍ରାହ୍ମଣ ସଂସ୍କୃତି, ଗୋଟେ ଉଚ୍ଚସ୍ତରୀୟ ସଂସ୍କୃତି, ଯାହାକୁ ହାଇ କଲଚର ବୋଲି କୁହାଯାଏ। ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କ ସାଙ୍ଗରେ ଯେ ମିଶିଛେ ଏବଂ ପଢିଛେ, ଆମେ ଜାଣିଥିବା ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ କେମିତି ଯେ ଗୋଟେ ଯେଉଁ ସଂସ୍କୃତି ଭୋଜି ମାନଙ୍କର, ଯେଉଁ ସଂସ୍କୃତି ନାଁରେ ମଣିଷ ପାଖରୁ ଦୂରେଇ ଯାଉଛି, ଉପରେ ରହୁଛି, ତାର କେତେ ସେ ଆମୂଳଚୂଳ ସମୀକ୍ଷକ ଥିଲେ, କେତେ ବିରୋଧ କରୁଥିଲେ। ତେଣୁ ଏମିତି ଏକ ସଂସ୍କୃତି ଯାହା ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ଜନଜୀବନର ଗୋଟେ ଛବି, ଗୋଟେ ସାଧନାର କଥା। ସେଇ ସଂସ୍କୃତିରେ ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ଦୈନନ୍ଦିନ ଜୀବନ, ଯେଉଁ ବ୍ୟବହାରିକ ଜୀବ, ଯେଉଁ ମେଟେରିଆଲ ସବୁ ରହିଛି, ମେଟେରିଆଲ କଲଚର ଏବଂ ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକ କଲଚର, ଆଉ ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକ ଏବଂ ବସ୍ତୁ ଦୁଇଟା ସେକା ଦୁଇ ପାର୍ଶ୍ୱର ଗୋଟିଏ କଥା। ଆଉ ଏଇ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ସେ ଯେଉଁ ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ସମୁଦାୟ ରହିଛି, କମ୍ୟୁନିଟି ଏଜୁକେସନ, ଆଉ ଇଭାନ ତାଙ୍କୁ ବୁଝିଛନ୍ତି ଏମିତି ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କ ଯେଉଁ ଶିକ୍ଷା କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ସେଇଟା ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିର ବିକାଶ ସହିତ ଗୋଟେ କମ୍ୟୁନିଟି ଏଜୁକେସନ ଥିଲା, କନଷ୍ଟ୍ରକ୍ସନ। ଆମେ ଯେଉଁ ପୋଖରୀ ଖୋଳିବା କଥା, ଏଇସବୁ ଗୋଟେ ନିର୍ମାଣ କାର୍ଯ୍ୟ, ଏଇସବୁ ମଣିଷକୁ ବିକାଶ କରିବାରେ ସାହାଯ୍ୟ କରେ। ଏହା ସହିତ ଗୋଟେ ଗଭୀର ଅସ୍ତିତ୍ୱ କଥା ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ଦିବ୍ୟ ଆଉ ମଣିଷ ଭିତରେ ସମ୍ପର୍କ, ତାକୁ ବୁଝିବାକୁ ହେଲେ ଆମକୁ ସ୍ପିନୋଜାଙ୍କ ସହିତ ବାଟ ଚାଲିବାକୁ ହବ। ସ୍ପିନୋଜା କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ କ'ଣ, ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ ହେଉଛନ୍ତି ଯେଉଁ ସ୍ପିନୋଜାଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ଈଶ୍ୱର, ସେ ଈଶ୍ୱର ହେଉଛନ୍ତି ବ୍ରହ୍ମାଣ୍ଡରେ ଯାହା କିଛି ହେଇଛି, ଯାହା କିଛି ସମ୍ଭାବନା, ସେ ହେଉଛନ୍ତି ଈଶ୍ୱର, ଏବଂ ସେଇ ସମ୍ଭାବନା ଅଲରେଡି ବାସ୍ତବାୟତ ହେଇଯାଇଛି ଏବଂ ହଉଛି। ଏବଂ ଏଇଟାକୁ ବୁଝିବାକୁ ଯାଇକି ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ, ତୁମେ, ମୁଁ, ଆପଣ, ସମସ୍ତେ ଏଇ ବ୍ରହ୍ମାଣ୍ଡର ଆମେ ଗୋଟେ ଗୋଟେ କଣିକା। ଆମେ ଏଇ କଂକ୍ରିଟଲି, ସେଥିରେ ଆଉ କିଛି ଏତେ ବେଶୀ ରହସ୍ୟବାଦ ନାହିଁ ଯେ ମୋ ଭିତରେ ଯେଉଁ ବ୍ରହ୍ମାଣ୍ଡର ସତ୍ତାଟି ରହିଛି, ଆପଣମାନଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ସେହା ରହିଛି। ତାକୁ ବୁଝିବାକୁ ଯାଇ ସେ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଦାର୍ଶନିକ କଥାଟିଏ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ କେତେକ ଜିନିଷ ରହିଛି ତାକୁ ଆମେ ମାସ୍ ନାଉନ୍ ବୋଲି କହିପାରିବା। ଯେମିତି ମତେ ଆପଣ ଗୋଟେ ଗ୍ଲାସ ପାଣି ଦିଅନ୍ତୁ, ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ପାଣିଟା ଅଛି, ଆଉ ଏଇଟା ମାନେ ଇଭାନଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ଗଭୀର ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ଅନୁଭବ, ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆପଣମାନେ ଅନୁଭବ କରୁଥିବେ ଯେ ଯେ ଦର୍ଶନଟା କେତେ ଜୀବନ୍ତ ହେଇପାରେ। ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ପାଣିଟିଏ ଅଛି, ଏଇ ପାଣିଟା ଯୋଉ ଅଛି ଏଇଟା କ'ଣ କେବଳ ଗ୍ଲାସ ଭିତରେ ପାଣିଟା ସୀମାବଦ୍ଧ କି? ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆପଣ ମୋତେ ଗ୍ଲାସ ପାଣି ଦଉଛନ୍ତି, ଏଇ ସମଗ୍ର ବିଶ୍ୱର ଯୋଉ ପାଣି, ସେ ପାଣିରୁ ଦଉଛନ୍ତି। ଠିକ ସେମିତି ମଣିଷ କହିଲେ କେବଳ ଗୋଟେ ଏବଷ୍ଟ୍ରାକ୍ଟ ମାନବିକତାକୁ ନ ବୁଝାଏ। ମୁଁ ରଣଧୀର ସାଙ୍ଗରେ କଥା ହଉଛି, ରଣଧୀର ହଉଛନ୍ତି ମଣିଷ। ସେଇ ମଣିଷଟି ଗୋଟେ ବିରାଟ ମନୁଷ୍ୟତ୍ୱର ଏକ କଂକ୍ରିଟ ଅଙ୍ଗ। ତେଣୁ ଠିକ ସେମିତି ଆଉ ଇଭାନ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଭାବେ ଅନୁଭବ କରି କହୁଛନ୍ତି, ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ଯେତେବେଳେ ମଣିଷର ବିକାଶ କଥା କହୁଥିଲେ, ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ମଣିଷର ବିକାଶ। ତେଣୁ ଆମେ ଅନୁଭବ କରିଥିବା ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ଯୋଉ ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତି ସହିତ କେମିତି ତାର ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିଗତ ଗୋଟେ ସୂତ୍ରରେ ସେ ସୂତ୍ରାୟିତ ହେଇଛନ୍ତି। କେବେ ଗୋଟେ ୟୁନିଭର୍ସାଲ ଫର୍ମୁଲା ଅନୁସାରେ କାହାରିକୁ ସେ ମୂଲ୍ୟାୟନ କରିନାହାନ୍ତି ବା ତାର ବିକାଶର ପଥଟି ତାର ଗୋଟେ ଢାଞ୍ଚା ବା ଗୋଟେ ଫର୍ମୁଲା ପ୍ରସ୍ତୁତ କରିକି ସେ କହିନାହାନ୍ତି। ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ କଥା ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଏଇସବୁ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ କ'ଣ ଘଟୁଛି, ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆମେ ମନୁଷ୍ୟ ଏବଂ ଦିବ୍ୟଙ୍କର ସମ୍ପର୍କ, ଉଦାହରଣ ସ୍ୱରୂପ ଈଶ୍ୱରଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ କିଙ୍ଗଡମ ବା ରାଜ୍ୟ, ଆଉ ଇଭାନ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଦି କିଙ୍ଗଡମ ଅଫ ଗଡ ଇଜ ଏ ପରଫର୍ମେଟିଭ ଇଭେଣ୍ଟ। ପରଫର୍ମେଟିଭ ଇଭେଣ୍ଟ ମାନେ ଆମେ ସାଙ୍ଗ ହେଇକି ତାକୁ ତିଆରି କରୁଛୁ। ଯେମିତି ଆପଣ ମାନେ ଗୋଟେ ଡ୍ରାମା କରୁଛନ୍ତି ସ୍କୁଲରେ, ଆମ ଗହଣରେ ସନ୍ତୋଷ ଭାଇ ଥାନ୍ତି ଢେଙ୍କାନାଳ, ସେ ବହୁତ ନାଟକ ଲେଖୁଛନ୍ତି। ନାଟକ ଲେଖୁଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇ ଯୋଉ ଘଣ୍ଟେଟିଏ ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ଗୋଟେ ନାଟକଟିଏ ଲେଖିଲେ, ସେଇ ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ଜୀବନ ସଞ୍ଚରଣଟା, ତା ଭିତରେ କେତେ ସମ୍ଭାବନା ପ୍ରସ୍ଫୁଟିତ ହଉଛି। ଠିକ ସେମିତି ଆମେ ଯେତେବେଳେ ହିଁ ପରସ୍ପର ପାଖକୁ ସମ୍ମିଳିତ ହେବା, ପରସ୍ପରର ସମ୍ଭାବନାକୁ ବିକାଶ ପାଇଁ ଉଦ୍ୟମ କରିବା, ସେତେବେଳେ ହିଁ କିଙ୍ଗଡମ ଅଫ ଗଡ ଆମ ଭିତରେ ଫୁଟି ଉଠିବେ। ଏବଂ ସେଇ ମୁହୂର୍ତ୍ତଟା ସବୁ ସମୟ ପାଇଁ ନ ରହିପାରେ, ପୁନଶ୍ଚ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆମେ ଜାଗ୍ରତ ହେବା, ସମ୍ମିଳିତ ହେବା, ପୁନଶ୍ଚ କିଙ୍ଗଡମ ଅଫ ଗଡ ଫୁଟି ଉଠିବ। ସଭା ଶେଷକୁ ସେ ରିବେଲର କଥାଟି କହୁଛନ୍ତି। ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ରିବେଲ କିଏ? ଯୋଉ ବିଦ୍ରୋହୀ ଆତ୍ମା, ସେ ସ୍ପିରିଟ ରିବେଲିୟସ୍, ଆମର ଖଲିଲ ଜିବ୍ରାନଙ୍କର ବି ବହିଟି ଅଛି, ଭାଇ ତାକୁ ଅନୁବାଦ କରିଛନ୍ତି। ଆଉ ଆଲବର୍ଟ କାମୁ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ରିବେଲଟା ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ସୀମାକୁ ସିଏ ସୀମା ବିଷୟରେ ସେ ଜାଗ୍ରତ ହୁଏ। ସେ ଗୋଟେ ସୀମାଟି ଯେ ଏଇ ସୀମା, ସେଇ ସୀମା ଯୋଉ ସୀମା ଗୋଟେ ଅବମାନନାର ସୀମା, ଗୋଟେ ଡିଗ୍ରେଡେସନର ସୀମା, ମୁଁ ତାକୁ ଗ୍ରହଣ କରିଥିଲି, ଆମେ ତାକୁ ଗ୍ରହଣ କରିବାନି, ଏଇଟା ଗ୍ରହଣୀୟ ନୁହଁ। ତେଣୁ ଏମିତି ଗୋଟେ ଗାର ଆମେ ଟାଣିଦେବା। ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ ସୀମାଟି ହେଉଛି ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ସେଇ ସୀମା ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ଗୋଟେ ଅସୀମର ଯୋଉ ପ୍ରସ୍ଫୁଟନ, ତା ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ସମ୍ଭାବନା କଥା। ଏହା ସହିତ ପ୍ରାଗ୍ମାଟିଜମ ବୋଲି ଆମେରିକାର ଯୋଉ ଦର୍ଶନ ଧାରା, ସେ ପ୍ରାଗ୍ମାଟିଜମ, ଏଇ ରିବେଲର କଥାଟି ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରାଗ୍ମାଟିକ କଥା। କାହିଁକି ପ୍ରାଗ୍ମାଟିଜମରେ ଯେମିତି ଜନ୍ ଡୁଇ ଥିଲେ, ସେ କେତେ ଶିକ୍ଷା କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ କେତେ କାମ କରିଛନ୍ତି, ଆମେ ଶିକ୍ଷା କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ଆଲୋଚନା କଲାବେଳେ ସେ ତାଙ୍କ କଥା ବି ପକେଇଥିଲୁ। ପ୍ରାଗ୍ମାଟିଜମ ମାନେ ଯାହା କିଛି ବ୍ୟବହାର ରହିଛି ତାକୁ ଗ୍ରହଣ କରନ୍ତିନି। ଯେମିତି ଆମର ଗୋଟେ ବ୍ୟବହାର ଥିବ ଯେ ଶ୍ରାଦ୍ଧ କଲାବେଳେ ତାକୁ ଗୋଟେ ବିଲେଇକୁ ଆଣିକି ତା ଗୋଡରେ ଗୋଟେ ଦଉଡି ବାନ୍ଧି ଦେଇକି ତାକୁ ଟାଙ୍ଗିଦବା, ସେଇଟା ଗୋଟେ ଯଦି ଥିବ, ସେଇଟା କ'ଣ ସବୁଦିନ ଆମେ ତାକୁ ପାଳନ କରିବା କି? ତେଣୁ ତା ପୁନଶ୍ଚ ଏଇ ସବୁ ଭିତରେ ଇଭାନ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ରଚନାରେ ଗୋଟେ ରିବେଲିୟନ ଅଛି, ବିଶେଷ କରି ପଲିଟିକାଲ ରାଇଟିଂସରେ। ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପଲିଟିକାଲ କ୍ରିଟିକ ହିସାବରେ, ସାମାଜିକ ଏବଂ ରାଜନୈତିକ ସମୀକ୍ଷକ ହିସାବରେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ଗୋଟେ ଅଗ୍ନି ଅଛି, ଗୋଟେ ଅନୁଭବ କରିଥିବା ତାଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ କ୍ରୋଧାଗ୍ନି ଅଛି। ସେଇ କ୍ରୋଧାଗ୍ନିଟା ଆମେ ଅନେକ ସମୟ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କୁ ଦୁର୍ବାସା ବୋଲି ଅନୁଭବ କରୁ। ସେ କ୍ରୋଧାଗ୍ନିଟା ପ୍ରକୃତରେ କ'ଣ, ତାକୁ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଭାବରେ ଇଭାନ ବୁଝିଛନ୍ତି। ସେ କ୍ରୋଧାଗ୍ନିଟା ହଉଛି ଯାହା କିଛି ସେ ଦେଖୁଛନ୍ତି, ଯୋଉଟା କି ଏତେ ଅବମାନନା ଘଟୁଛି, ତା ସହିତ ତାଙ୍କର ଧୈର୍ଯ୍ୟ ନାହିଁ, ପରସିଭ କରିବାର ଧୈର୍ଯ୍ୟ ନାହିଁ। ଆଉ ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ କଥା ହଉଛି, ଯଦିଓ ଏଇ ସବୁ ଜିନିଷ ଯାହା ଦେଖୁଛନ୍ତି ତାକୁ ପରସିଭ କରିବାର ଧୈର୍ଯ୍ୟ ନାହିଁ, କିନ୍ତୁ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଲୋକମାନଙ୍କ ସାଙ୍ଗରେ ସେ ମିଶୁଛନ୍ତି, ତାଙ୍କର ଅନେକ ଧୈର୍ଯ୍ୟ ରହୁଛି, ଅସୀମ ଧୈର୍ଯ୍ୟ ରହୁଛି। ଏବଂ ସଭା ଶେଷକୁ ସେ ଉଦାହରଣ ଦେଉଛନ୍ତି, ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ମୂଲ୍ୟବୋଧର ଯୋଉ ଅବକ୍ଷୟ ଘଟୁଛି, ସେ ଅବକ୍ଷୟଟା ହଉଛି ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରକାର ରୁଗ୍ଣ ବସ୍ତୁବାଦିତା। ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ବସ୍ତୁବାଦର ବିରୋଧ ନୁହନ୍ତି। ଆଉ ଆପଣମାନେ ଓଡ଼ିଆରେ ତାଙ୍କର ପ୍ରବନ୍ଧଟିଏ ପଢିଥିବେ, ବସ୍ତୁରେ କି କ'ଣ ଦୋଷ। ମାନେ ଜଣେ ଲୋକର ତାର ଦରକାର ପଡୁଛି এই বস্তুটা ଦରକାର ତାର କ'ଣ ଦୋଷ ଅଛି କିନ୍ତୁ ବସ୍ତୁବାଦୀ ଭିତରେ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆମେ ବସ୍ତୁବାଦ ସେ ଜୀବନର ସର୍ବୋଚ୍ଚ ମୂଲ୍ୟ ଆଉ ଇଭାନ ତାକୁ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଭାବରେ ସେ ଏସେଟି ପଢିଛନ୍ତି ଆଉ ତା ସହିତ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଏସେଜ ଅଫ୍ ଚିତ୍ତ ରଞ୍ଜନ ଦାସରେ ଫୋକ୍ କଲଚର ଏବଂ ଫୋକ୍ ଆର୍ଟ ହିସାବରେ ଯୋଉ ଲେଖାଟି ଲେଖିଛନ୍ତି ତାକୁ ଇଭାନ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର ଭାବରେ ବିଶ୍ଳେଷଣ କରି କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଗୋଟେ ଜାତିର ଯେତେବେଳେ ତାର କଳା ଆଉ ତାର ଚାରୁକାର୍ଯ୍ୟମାନ ସେଇଟା କେମିତି ତାର ଗୋଟେ ତାର ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିର ତାର ଗୋଟେ ସୃଜନଶୀଳ ପରିପ୍ରକାଶ କିନ୍ତୁ ଯେତେବେଳେ ସେ କମୋଡିଟି ହେଇଯାଏ ଅବଶ୍ୟ ତାର ବଞ୍ଚିବା ପାଇଁ ତାର ସାହାରା ଦରକାର ତାର ଅର୍ଥ ଦରକାର କିନ୍ତୁ କେବଳ ଯଦି ତାକୁ ବିକିବା ପାଇଁ ସେ ଗୋଟେ ସେଲ୍ସ ପର୍ସନ ହେଇଗଲା ଆତ୍ମା ସେଠି ମରି ମରିଯାଏ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ଭାରି ଗଭୀର କଥାଟିଏ କହିଲେ ଯେ ପଲ୍ ଟିଲିଚ ବୋଲି ଜଣେ ଗଭୀର ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ଧର୍ମତତ୍ତ୍ୱବିତ୍ ଆଉ ମୁଁ ଜାଣିଛି ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ତାଙ୍କର ଲେଖାଙ୍କୁ ଭାରି ଭଲ ପାଉଥିଲେ ଆଉ ସେ କହିଲେ ପଲ୍ ଟିଲିଚଙ୍କର ଏବଂ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କର ଚିନ୍ତାରେ ଅନେକ ସାମଞ୍ଜସ୍ୟ ରହିଛି ପଲ୍ ଟିଲିଚ କହୁଥିଲେ ଯେ ଗୋଟେ ଆଇଡଲ ମୂର୍ତ୍ତିଟିଏ ଆଉ ଈଶ୍ୱରଙ୍କ ଭିତରେ ଫରକ କ'ଣ ଅଛି ତେଣୁ ଯୋଉ ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆମେ କେବଳ ଆଇଡଲ ଭିତରେ ମାନେ ବଞ୍ଚିଯିବା ସେଠି କେବଳ ତାହାରି ଭିତରେ ବାନ୍ଧି ହେଇଯିବା ତ ଈଶ୍ୱର ଧୀରେ ଧୀରେ ସେଠୁ କୁଆଡେ କୁଆଡେ ହଜି ଯାଆନ୍ତି ବା ଲୁକାୟିତ ହୁଅନ୍ତି So with this translation of Ivan's very deep set of thoughts and insights, so now let us join Ivan in our conversations. So to initiate this, I invite Gyan Luigi, Dr. Gyan Luigi Segalarpa, a very creative and critical philosopher, and who can greet us in Italian as well as German.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was wonderful. Well, I have gained so many suggestions. The first one is perhaps this one. I think that as regards Spinoza, I think that Spinoza has this problem. That is, it's true that we are cosmic, that I and you and Ishi, we are all cosmic, but the great problem for Spinoza, both in the Ethics and in his theological political treatise, at least seems to me to be the way out of the original condition of ignorance. That is, it's authentic, we are cosmic, but the problem is that most of us we all do not know this at the beginning of our life, before our project and way of education. And this education is very difficult. That is, he ends the ethics not accidentally by saying all which is supreme is rare. That is, difficult and rare. It is not something, this education up to the greatest level, it is not something which can be realized very easily. On the contrary, it is very difficult. And that is the problem, in my opinion, for him. That is that he has a condition of the world which says we are all one, we are cosmic, but the problem is it is difficult for us to know this with a real founded comprehension of our condition. The way out of imagination, which for Spinoza is rather negative, and from the passivity of our condition, which consigns every one of us, at least at the beginning, before the education, the due education, to a condition of ignorance. The way out of this initial negative condition seems to be not at all easy, and perhaps more than this, it is not something which is definitive, because we are passive. It is, we are exposed to passions, we are exposed all during our life to the always coming about of conditions of ignorance and of imagination. This is the problem, in my opinion. At least this is the impression that I have when I read him. That to the human condition is necessarily, unfortunately, associated a condition of ignorance and of exposure to at least to up to a certain point exposure to ignorance and to irrationality, because imagination is also can cause irrationality and passions, which are negative for him, rather negative. And well, this is the first point which I had been reflecting on during the very interesting contribution analysis. And then as regards Camus, I would say I have the impression that for Camus, the condition of rebellion is also a condition of rebellion against every form of conformism. That is, he polemized, for instance, against some interpretation of the Marxist tradition from which he derived, but he was not at ease, at least in some moments, with some groups of the French intellectuals, because he accused them of conformism and therefore of oppression against the workers. He said, you are making something which is not good for the workers, because instead of liberating them, you are oppressing them in so far as you are compelling them to a conformism towards the ideology. That is, you are another form of conformism. This is a point which, among other things, Camus paid very much, because he was despised, he was condemned by the Marxists, and of course, in particular by Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote against him an article in Tempo Moderne in 1952, if I am not mistaken, in which he accused Camus of being inspired by a reactionary, a tendentially reactionary way of thinking. Therefore, he had to pay for his criticism of the Marxian tradition, of the Marxian interpretation of the society. And this is a point which in Camus is a hard point. It's a hard point really when one studies him. Thank you very much. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Gianluigi. And maybe, Ivan, we can request you to gather a few thoughts and then come after 4 or 5 interventions so that we can have a little bit more points of view.
Yeah, let me just address these things very quickly, because that way I can keep them in my mind. I'll keep it very brief. Number one, I'll just simply say that I agree with what he's saying. With regards to Spinoza, Spinoza's effort is an effort contrary to the one of Chitta Bai. For Spinoza, spiritual development, if you want to use that terminology, it's an effort of understanding. So he's not as interested in like, oh, let's just simply develop human potentiality. What he's interested is for human beings to get to a stage of, in a way, reminds me of the task of the Stoic. You know, what we're trying to achieve is equanimity. And the way to do it is actually by understanding the world aright, so to speak. So a lot of his work is actually to do kind of like metaphysical housekeeping so that we can see things the way they truly are, so to speak. And for him, in the end, the sage, if you want to use that word, achieves his idea of equanimity, which is joy, by understanding that things are just the way they are, and in a way, just the way they need to be, because they just simply are what they are. And number two, to understand that it is fine because you're able to acquire such a broad perspective, which is what he calls the perspective of eternity. And from the perspective of eternity, then the provincialism of the passions and the limitedness of, like, you know, selfish egotism and the idea of like freedom drop out of the equation, and you simply are finally capable to dwell in the cosmos in your proper place, so to speak. And things actually acquire their proper value once you measure them relative to the totality. So that's number one. Number two, with regards to Camus, I'm completely in accordance with what he says. Camus paid a very, very high price for what he was doing. The way he talked about what he was doing, ultimately, in several essays, he calls it a commitment to intelligence, is the word that he gave it. You know, and in a way, even more than a commitment to truth, because he understood that truth, in some regard, truth is relative in the sense that whatever will be, it's not relative in the sense that your truth is different from my truth. He thinks that truth is a historical event, and hence he will keep moving. And the commitment to intelligence is, number one, a commitment of understanding that, and number two, a commitment to having a type of sagacity where you understand how other people are getting stuck in, sometimes in all truths, and sometimes in the idea of using truth, an appeal to truth, to hide actually other motivations that are not epistemological, if you want to use that term, but are simply will to power or whatever else. And so for him, the true word is actually a commitment to intelligence. And the work of rebellion at the level of like the task of thought is actually a work of a commitment to intelligence. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ivan. And now, Anil Bhai, please. Anil Bhai? Okay. Anil Bhai is taking some time. Then Dr. Janal Singh Anand. Okay. Minati, please.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Professor Ivan Marquez for his very deep philosophical presentation. I was listening to all these values and philosophies of Albert Camus and Chitta Ranjan. My one question is, among Albert Camus' philosophy, there was absurdism. I mean, how we can relate what were the similarities and differences were there between on this particular philosophy between Chitta Ranjan and Albert Camus. So if you put a little bit light on this, so we'll be thankful. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Do you want me to do that now, Ananta? I'll do that. Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. I will just reiterate one thing that I said before, which is I think one of the differences is that I think at the end of the day, Chitta Bai does come from a tradition that is nourished by Indian Hindu.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, can I go? Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, for lack of a better term, because I don't really like this term, but I don't, it's just shorthand, so bear with me. At the end of the day, Chitta Bai is an Indian thinker. And hence his notions of human development, his notions of what the individual means and what individuality means are going to be different from the ones that Camus subscribes to. Camus, in some odd way, is actually an incredibly European thinker. He comes from a tradition of the Cartesian ego, really, you know, and hence, you know, his idea of individualism comes from a very different tradition. It's not from the tradition of like you know the ideas about the self from Buddha, or like from like the older tradition of Hinduism. And hence, when they both speak about a commitment to the individual, it's a very different notion, and that needs to be understood, because when in translation we might be using the same words, but they're just not the same in many, many really important ways. So that's one big difference. The other thing that I want to say is that Camus is coming from a perspective of, like people mentioned, from a perspective of existentialism, European existentialism, and ultimately from the perspective that was opened up by Nietzsche. And it is it's a perspective where the great problem of European culture is the problem of nihilism and the forms of reaction to nihilism. And for example, understanding fascism and understanding the advent of a type of scientism as reactions to this nihilism, reactions that both the existentialists and Camus found incredibly problematic and literally pathological. So in a way, the philosophical problem of the 20th century, to a great extent, was the problem of nihilism. And that's a narrative that runs really strong in continental philosophy in Europe, but also very, very strong in Camus. I mean, Chitta is not particularly concerned, or certainly is not engrossed in trying to battle nihilism. That's just not part of like his philosophical temperament. It doesn't mean, again, that he doesn't have an idea of like a commitment to life in spite of, and in a way you could say, in spite of what? Well, in spite of the fact that the world is a place of suffering, and that the place has a lot of element of absurdity, and is a place of waste, but to say that what his sentiment, what his pessimism, if you want to call it like that, what his pessimism is, can be placed within the tradition of European nihilism, I think that's just not the case. And hence, at some point one has to draw a line in the sand and be like, yeah, these people have certain affinities and there's certain kindredness, but the fact is that Chitta is not fighting the specter of nihilism. He just isn't. He's fighting, if anything, what he thinks is the betrayal and the waste of a historical opportunity that was opened up by the Free India movement, and simply trying to keep that alive and try to keep it morally straight. By what? By the Camus idea of by using intelligence. That's what I would say. Ananta, I cannot hear you. Okay, now.
Thank you.
Lovely, Ivan. Both the question and the answer are becoming so enlightening. And now we have some new friends who have also joined us. Ananya, please, Dr. Ananya Behera. Please unmute yourself. Then Satyajit Jena. Okay, as you are getting ready, Dr. Anand. And we have with us Dr. Alborson, Dr. Hind Alborson. We invite you to kindly share some thought. Okay. Then Sandhya Appa, please. Sandhya Appa. You can speak in Odia, I can translate. Okay, as you are taking time, now Randhir and Devendra, please.
Thank you so much for very philosophically sound talk. And my question is, sometimes we confuse one concept with another. In that sense, the question of rebellion is not the same as the question of tolerance, which seem to be confused. Tolerating rebellion is the same as tolerating injustice, tolerating terror. In a democracy, democracy has built in ways of changing laws and policies. So terrorizing by people who have certain other people should be terrorized, harassed, or for that matter, disrespect, is deeply anti-democratic. although the order of state is governed by the state, how the state implements its organizing activity and controls the emergence of social problems should be responsive to the voices of the informed people. It is a question of inclusion and procedure. The people are supposed to discuss, the people are supposed to debate, not rebel. I think I have just read one book on Chitta Ranjan Das. He is a person who celebrates the idea of debating and discussion. I have seen 1-2 videos. A kind of empathetic approach during his conversation, I find. His journey was not as a journey of rebellion. His journey as a, as a practitioner of totally, ahimsa, vadi, and like practitioner of, deep communicator of society, who indulge all the process building of society with peace and love and affection, and nurture of the very idea of indigenous sovereignty. So that is one question. And another thing about, if you think about God, I have read somewhere God retained philosophically, not by grace. Even those who believe in atheism, atheism is not in reality a rejection of God. It is a rejection of imagination and thoughts made by man to describe God. That's how it is possible to deny the energy or the wisdom which manifests in all being and the entire existence. So even I find even nihilism and atheism, there is a kind of a scope of the metaphysical sense of, God. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Randhir.
Sir,
Okay.
may I?
Okay. Yeah.
Devendra this side. Sir, first of all, I would like to say thanks to Dr. Ivan Marcus for his brilliant presentation. And out of his presentations, few observations I have noted. Particularly talking of Albert Camus and the thought of rebel or rebellion. I'm a student of literature, and one very relevant text by Albert Camus is Myth of Sisyphus. We cannot ignore Myth of Sisyphus. And in Myth of Sisyphus, how beautifully Albert Camus has presented the exercise of rebellion and then absurdity. Sisyphus, a mythological king, rebels against practice of God. He misguides God, means when he was to be taken to hell or heaven at the last moment of his life, he misguides God twice. He tries to escape from God. And finally, as the punishment of the deed he did, he was punished to do an absurd task, and that was to put a ball at the top of the hill. And definitely a ball cannot stand stable at the top of the hill. But the kind of punishment he was given, he started enjoying the punishment, that absurd practice. So definitely Albert Camus very beautifully gave the concept of rebellion, element of rebellion as well as absurdity is visible, very clear in his work. Another thing I noted down, particularly when Dr. Ivan Marcus sir were presenting his opinion, a single sentence, God is just a word. and particularly as I'm talking about absurdity and absurd thought. So I would like to recall Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, an absurd play. How beautifully Samuel Beckett has presented absurd practices, particularly by post-modern man, post-war man, through the persona of Vladimir and Stragan. How just they are waiting for someone, a symbolic god, because the spelling of God is Godot. They say ki nobody comes, nobody go. We are still waiting for Godot, and nothing happens at the end of it. Finally, to conclude my opinion, I would like to say Professor Marquez pointed out one statement that was some humans are more equal than others, and that has a very deep connection with the modern novelist George Orwell in his famous novel Animal Farm. While commenting on the dictators of Europe, particularly during war and post-war, he said just it was a satire. Some animals are more equal than others. Means they promise something else, but they exercise something else. So definitely that was a nice statement from Dr. Ivan Marquez. We enjoyed, and thank you very much, sir, for presenting your benign thoughts. Thank you so much.
Ananta, you want me to speak to them?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. I mean, these interventions are a lot more broad, so my answers are going to be more less pointed. I'll go to the first one. What you're pointing out, it's true, and it's a real. I mean, unfortunately, it's a real problem. Once you decide that you're going to walk away from the metaphysical perspective, once you decide that you're going to walk away from the search for a ground of things, or for the search of like a view from nowhere, you put yourself at the center of meaning giving. When you do that, the prerogatives that you give to yourself are the same ones that a demand for consistency would make you have to give to other people. And by that, what I mean is that once we toss away the idea of absolute truth, or the idea of justice with capital J, or the idea of a metaphysical realm that actually organizes everything and gives meaning and justifies things ultimately, you are engaged in a horizontal plane with other people that constitutively have an equal right to assert their claim, so to speak. This can be seen as catastrophic, and be, one can decide that, well, we're just simply mired in some horrible relativism. And to make it even worse, it's a relativism that is not even just simply conceptual relativism and in a way an intellectual exercise, an absurd intellectual exercise, but it is a relativism where the players, formally speaking, have an equal right to a view, but in reality, we are social subjects and agents that are in a network of power where we have differential powers. So yeah, you have a view and I have a view, and from an epistemological point of view, your view and my view are equally valid as claims. But you and I know that your view might really carry more weight because you have more power. And hence, from an epistemological point of view, yeah, in principle, I'll respect you and vice versa. But in practice, your voice simply carries way more weight. And hence, in the end, what appears to be simply a problem of the incapacity for agreement between people that hold different views, which is still there, it's made even worse because what happens in this quote unquote conversations about values that might be even incommensurable is actually an agonistics of power. You and I are not simply battling views that are at odds, but we're battling them very often from positions of power inequality. And hence, you know, the problem that compounds itself greatly. And so when you have then all of a sudden the right to rebel, I also have the right to rebel. In fact, in the United States at the moment, the rich people that have a lot of money are quote unquote rebelling. For example, they're trying to pass legislation that every bank account that has more than $600 can be checked by the Internal Revenue Service, by the Department of Treasury, to see what is it that you're doing with your money. And the rich people are claiming that this is a great injustice. You know, so they are literally rebelling. They think this is oppressive. But yeah, but it is one thing to have multi-millionaires rebelling than to have nobody's rebelling, you know. What I want to say about this is that once you get that genie out of the bottle, once you walk away from metaphysics and you try to do without, you don't have that further level of appeal. In the past, we could appeal to God or we could appeal to truth with capital T. Now we can only appeal to each other. And hence, you know, I believe that although this gives us tremendous potential for developing ourselves in ways that are in tune with our precious individuality, it also creates what I will call practical problems and also limits. And hence, I think the solutions to those limitations are not philosophical solutions. They have to be procedural solutions and also like literally social solutions. So one thing that one can do, for example, democracies work better in places that are more highly equal and more highly homogeneous, but it's simply because of the reason that actually when you're similar to other people, broadly speaking, you're going to converge. And also, if you're more equal economically, your voice is going to have as much power and weight as their voice. So in a way, it just simply mitigates the problem of like pluralism, so to speak. If you have a society that is highly economically unequal and highly heterogeneous in terms of like whatever you want to call it, cultural backgrounds, races, you name it, fundamental views about life, you're going to get yourself to a point that you're going to be living in a Babel. But even worse than a Babel, because it's going to be a Babel that is also a battlefield Babel. So it's double Babel. So what are the solutions? I think one of the solutions is just a type of containment policies. By that, what I mean is like, yeah, let's keep engaging with participatory democracy, but then let's actually create spheres of political community. So one of the ways of dealing with like containing the destructive effects of pluralism in terms of gridlock and what have you is try to always go to the lowest level of decision making that you can. Leave things local, because hopefully by leaving things as locally as you can, you kind of like end up with lower levels of pluralism and more levels of equity, power equity. And that will simply allow for decisions and for collective will formation to happen at that level. Does this always solve everything? Is this a panacea? No, it's not. And at some point, for example, separation is needed. You know, I mean, it is an empirical question, for example, if India and Pakistan needed to separate themselves, but that was a solution. And it's not always the case that we can work it out in a group. Sometimes the only way to thrive and to achieve our full potentiality is to live apart and tend to flourish. So that is what I can say about that. I mean, with the whole idea about atheism and nihilism that you mentioned, I think at the end of the day, an individual like Camus would say that, and this will connect to the other speaker, an individual like Camus would say that actually that nihilism and atheism are still thought reactions or cultural reactions that are still hung up on the old paradigm. They're still reactions of despair to the death of God, the death of the European God, so to speak. So for him, I think he still thinks that those reactions are not ultimate, they're not ultimate philosophical positions. They're just simply the last pangs of the death of the previous way of thinking about spirituality and the divine. In a way, it's people that are still, like we would say in the United States, it's like you still pinning for Santa Claus not to be fake. You want Santa Claus to exist, and they told you, no, Santa Claus doesn't exist, and you're still rebelling against that reality. I think one of the things that Camus is trying to do, and why he's a post-metaphysical thinker, is that he is trying to people to truly move on and to truly create a different type of relation to transcendence. And one, unfortunately, that puts the onus on the individual. So when God dies, you all of a sudden have infinite responsibility. And a lot of his work has a lot to do with the fact of what does it mean to have infinite responsibility? And how do you construct political communities and social communities and even notions of the self with that level of responsibility, which is literally infinite. And I think we are still now, whatever, 50 years later, we're still struggling with how do you construct a post-metaphysical world? And how can you redescribe and reconceive all these notions of truth, spirituality, justice in a post-metaphysical era? I think we're at the very infancy. The previous system lasted literally thousands of years. So it has a lot of karma, and it will take very, 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 very long to get out of the shadows, out of the doldrums. And we are not even remotely there, even remotely. So that's what I have to say about that. With regards to the other speaker, I'll say a few things. When I read Camus' book, like The Myth of Sisyphus, or when I read his novels, you know, for example, The Stranger. I was talking to my son about this because he's 18 and he just finished reading The Stranger. And he told me, I don't know, I find that there's a lot of things that I just don't really understand. They have to do with philosophical issues that I don't really fully grasp because I'm not cognizant. And I said, yeah, I think there's something about that. But I told him, and this is the important part. I told him, but you know what? I think Camus is a truly exceptional literary writer, because I think truly exceptional writers are able to create universes that are truly like real life. And then I told him, and what I mean about that is that in real life, you can never reduce an individual to a system. The individuals are always in a way bigger and smaller than the system. There's never, using like Derrida terminology or other people, you know, or people that you know, like Schelling and people like that. The individual always surpasses the totality. Totality always wants to swallow you within the concept. This is a very Hegelian type of idea, except that it's anti-Hegelian in the sense that the individual will always be, again, bigger and smaller than the totality. I mean, Kierkegaard made a whole career out of playing with these notions, right? And I believe that truly good writers, they are not formulaic. The characters are not, they're not to be summarized in a consistent system. In a way, it's like like the ideas of Gödel incompleteness system, the systems will always have inner contradictions. The system will never be a closed system. If it's closed, it's inconsistent, you know. And hence good writers actually leave that openness of the system. So when I read Camus, and this is now I'm going to make a hermeneutical or interpretive point. When I read Camus, I always have a lot of trouble feeling comfortable saying this is what Camus thinks, because I don't think that there's anything as such. Camus thinks a lot of different things, and I think Camus, either in spite of him or on purpose, he never can be summarized into like, oh, the myth of Sisyphus means this, or like, you know, Meursault in like The Stranger, the guy was this. No, the guy was a lot of things. He was angry and he was apathetic and he believed like in like the transcendent world, and at the same times not. You know, he was a sage and he was a fool. And I think that's a sign of a truly great writer. And in a way, oddly enough, I think it's also to go back to even what Camus said himself. A writer that doesn't try to create a closed system within literature is a writer that actually, in practice, at the level of performative, is being an anti-metaphysical writer. Because one of the ways of defining metaphysics is to create totalities, and totalities that have kind of like a type of phagocytic tendency. Totalities like that, they are totalitarian. They eat their parts. They subsume everything to the concept by force if necessary. Sometimes it doesn't have to be by force. I just simply summarize you. I simply eliminate vagueness. A lot of times I write vaguely, and people tell me, "Oh, you could have made this more. You know, you could delineate things better." And I'm like, "No, if I do that, I create still life. I killed the living thing, and I make it. If I'm going to understand a lizard, I can understand it by letting it live and just look at the lizard. I can kill the lizard and open it, but a dead lizard is not the lizard. The dead lizard is a dead lizard." And hence, you know, I think there's an element of how is it that these individuals are trying to do philosophy, and then how is it that we should read them because of that, you know. And I believe that in my way of interpreting Camus, I believe that I find myself very uncomfortable just making categorical claims about what Camus says or not, because I believe that he always left that he never succumbed to closure. And to that extent, you know, I think he's very slippery. Be it as it may, Camus would say that we are still stuck in some paradox, perhaps, where, yeah, you cannot achieve closure, but you still need to decide and act, and you need to judge. And hence, it's a weird existential space where you are forced to make decisions, and in a way, you're forced to make judgments, and you're forced to like promote certain possibilities that in a way preclude others. So actually, you have radical choice. Especially a person like Camus would believe in radical choice. But you have to do it without any sort of, against no metaphysical backdrop. You might be radically wrong. And a lot of bad stuff is going to come out by you being radically wrong. And hence, you know, that brings me back to this idea that the stone that you're moving up the hill, that Sisyphus is moving up the hill, in a way, it's an effort not only of meaning making, but also an effort of like self-overcoming. But it's an effort that is always against like the basic entropy of like the universe always being open and never really achieving the final resting place. There is no final resting place. And in fact, for people like Camus, the sheer thought of a final resting place is actually not only inaccurate, but kind of like fascistic, because it precludes further development of like the potentiality of the universe, so to speak, and also the potentiality of you and I individually and collectively and across time historically. That's a long answer. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for explaining each thing in a very detailed manner. And it is really a philosophically sound conversation and
Cool.
always healing to listen people like you.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Tiwari, please give a vote of thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. It's my honor and privilege to extend a vote of thanks at this August moment for this webinar organized by Swadhyaya Sachakra. It's fourth Swadhyaya Sachakra Chitta Ranjan Das Memorial Lecture. And really, our distinguished speaker has made it memorable, particularly by his deliberations first, and then answering one and all the questions and comments and queries gradually. So for that, I bow my head in his in a kind of a gesture to say or convey my thanks to Dr. Ivan Marquez sir for your great contribution to make this day memorable forever.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to express my deep thank and gratitude to Professor Anant Giri sir for being the moderator of the session and raising various issues and translating the thoughts of Dr. Ivan time and again. I would like to express my deep thank to Dr. Gyan Luigi for raising his opinion and presenting his observations in a very nutshell, but very effectively. I would also like to express my gratitude to Minati Pradhan ji for raising a very burning question, particularly absurdity, the relation of absurdity in the thoughts of Chitta Ranjan Das and our Albert Camus. I would like to express my thanks to Professor Janel Singhanand sir. He was present and definitely he is a kind of generous person, and my thanks are definitely there for him also. So finally, I would like to express my deep felt gratitude to all the participants from all over the world for their generosity and presentation, raising the queries and participating actively. I would like to express my thanks to Dr. Santosh Singh, our colleague. He is a very sincere person and he participates in all such kind of activities. Last but not the least, I would like to express my gratitude to co-convener of the event, Dr. Randhir Gautam, for convening, executing and planning everything. So that we are in a position to say it was a grand success webinar. So thank you, Randhir sir, and that's it from my side. And I would like to say namaste to each and everybody.
Thank you.
For being here
Thank you.
and making it successful. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you for doing my work from my behalf. Thank you.
and maybe Minati, you would add a line, please. So you become two. Would you like to add just thank vote of thanks, one line from you.
Okay, vote of thanks. Thank you, Professor Ivan Marquez, for a deep philosophical thing. And I thank Ananta Bhai also for thinking this type of thing, which is us to dig deep into different dimensions. And thank you for Professor Devendra Tiwari for taking up my job and relieving me today. So I was a bit apprehensive. No, I never do it formally. How to do it, I was a little bit. So, and thank you, Randhir, also for giving all the information in time and clearing all the doubts regarding these things. I mean, the timing and things. So thank you all, and thank you, Gyan Luigi, for being a consistent participant, and thanks to other participants. So it has become like a co-vote of thanks. Like.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you and good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Good
Thank you.
night, Ivan. Love you.
Yeah. Take good care. Thanks to everybody. It was great. I'm glad we did
Thank
it.
you